Hello there, I'm Alex, and I sell cheese for a living. As a cheesemonger and certified cheese professional, I have helped thousands of customers find their favorite cheese. Each episode, I will share what I've learned from behind the counter as we dive into the vast, fascinating world of all things cheese. Today's episode is not necessarily about the cheeses you already know and love, although most of these may sound familiar. This is not going to be about cheddar or brie or any safe pick that you can get from a cheese counter. Today, we are talking all about cheeses that are a little bit difficult. Either difficult to make, difficult to eat, or for me, some that are difficult to pronounce and to say with confidence that you aren't butchering a word. Cheese at its core is controlled milk spoilage, and the cheeses we're going to talk about today push that idea to the very edge of what is acceptable to still eat. Now, before we get into it, I think it's worth asking a question. Why even talk about difficult cheeses at all? Why tricky cheeses are interesting or worth paying attention to? But I think it's interesting to talk about it because some of them reveal the limits of what cheese making can be. And some of them show us how far a tradition can go and still be implemented in a modern society, how much control or lack of control exists in some processes, and how much of our taste is shaped by culture and what is acceptable and appropriate, not exactly just about the flavor. And even if you never try some of these cheeses, understanding them makes every other cheese make a little more sense when you have something to compare it to. So today we're going to be talking about 4 categories: biology that's gone a little crazy, the scarcity and rarity section, cheeses that require extreme precision, and cheeses that age through controlled chaos. And along the way, we're going to be talking about what actually makes a cheese difficult, and does the difficulty even matter? These are the cheeses that challenge people immediately, the biology gone wild section. And we're going to start with Casu Marzu. Casu Marzu begins as a fairly standard sheep's milk cheese, but then it is intentionally exposed to cheese flies, which lay eggs. I should have probably said at the beginning of this episode, we're going to talk about some less than appealing cheese making methods. So if you do have a little bit of a squeamishness to your personality, this might not be a great episode for you. But if you can stomach through and, get some good life lessons out of it, then please feel free to stay and enjoy. But full spoiler, there will be some interesting verbiage and cheese making processes that we're going to talk about. So, strap in. Casu Marzu, back to that, it's exposed to cheese flies, which lay eggs, and the eggs hatch into larvae, and those larvae break down the cheese. The cheese flies literally put their eggs into the exterior of the cheese for those larvae to then break down the proteins in the cheese. And it creates a soft, almost liquid interior with an extremely intense flavor. Now, why is this cheese a difficult cheese? Well, you are relying on live organisms to transform the cheese. It's a little less about a fully controllable process. It's more of a fine line between transformation and spoilage. But the bigger challenge for most people would be the psychological barrier. And this is where the difficulty becomes less about skill and a little more about comfort. Many people will never try this cheese, not because they understand it and reject it, but because they just can't get past what it represents. Because it forces us to question where we draw the line in food. You'll eat moldy blue cheese, and that's quite acceptable. The bacteria in washed rind cheeses are often celebrated for their stink and funk flavor. So why does this cheese feel so different? It is the societal expectation that some things we as a people will not eat. There are parts of the world where this cheese could be someone's favorite cheese. So if you are ever out and around in the world and you get a chance to try Casu Marzu, go for it. And then let me know how it was, because I myself have not tried it yet. I have never been in an area where I could be experienced to it. But if you get a chance to try it, please do. Let me know. Next, we're going to talk about Milben Casu. Kas? I told you some of these words are a little difficult for me. And it is aged using mites that consume the outer layer of the cheese. Similar to the flies and the larvae, these cheese mites will transform the rind, and that helps contribute to the flavor. Now, why this one is difficult, very similar to the other one, it requires maintaining a living ecosystem. And so to have that be effective, you need very precise environmental balance. And to age it properly takes long-term biological interaction. Now, this cheese highlights what cheese making isn't always about, which is control. It's about cooperation with nature, intended nature, but nature all the same. And again, the difficulty for most people here is mental, not the technical aspect of dumping a bunch of bugs on a cheese wheel and letting it age to perfection. I know there's a few other cheeses that would fit into this category of living critters helping the cheese along its way or to ripeness. But next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the scarcity and rarity cheeses. That makes them a little difficult, mostly just to find, because the difficulty here comes from limitation. And if you looked at this famous donkey milk cheese called poulet, it is produced in very small quantities. And so its difficulty is just to find it. Donkeys have extremely low milk yield, a difficult coagulation process for the milk handlers, and it is very high labor and resource demand. So this type of cheese shows that not all difficulty is dramatic or shocking. Sometimes it's very simple and plain, but less economical. And it also raises the question, does the rarity increase its value or just its perception of value? Next, we're going to talk about cheeses that demand technical perfection. And this is where cheese starts to look a little less rustic craft and more very scientific discipline. Small mistakes don't just change the outcome, they can ruin the entire batch of what they've been working on, the cheesemakers. And the first one, you've definitely heard of it, I've talked about it, is Parmigiano Reggiano. Large scale production with very strict rules and fairly long aging. And why is this one difficult? Well, the long aging. It takes years for it to come to full maturity before it's ready to sell. And so in that time, while you're making other cheese wheels day to day, you also have to have someone be a steward to take care of those existing wheels and make sure that there's no faults being created or there's no damage happening to them. They're being rotated if needed. The long aging time definitely makes this cheese very difficult to produce. And the risk in it is kind of high if something goes wrong. If they, a year down the road after making this wheel of Parmigiano Reggiano, they find a crack or a fault or something fell on it or something at all is imperfect, they cannot sell that as Parmigiano Reggiano. And so after a year of, maybe not daily agonizing work to keep the cheese wheel safe, but it could all go down the drain if something doesn't meet up to their standards. And that kind of scale of consistency is incredible. Now, granted, the people who have been making this cheese for the last however many years, they have it down to an exact science. And so once you do it enough, you kind of get the idea. And so doing it repeatedly shouldn't be that hard. But still, having cheeses that consistently excellent for millions of wheels a year, every year, it's very, very, very cool. Now, while this is the opposite of what I would say is a chaotic cheese, it represents discipline, control, and very much tradition. And talking about it helps balance the idea that some people have that great cheese isn't just wild. It can also be incredibly precise. And maybe even more importantly, it shows that time amplifies mistakes. You're not just making cheese, you're kind of committing to a result you won't fully understand for years. And with much hope that after those years, you have a product ready for sale. Next, we're going to look at mozzarella di bufala, a fresh cheese that must be stretched at exactly the right moment. A little bit more precision talk here as to why it's difficult. The timing is critical. There is no room for correction. And if you're going to eat it properly, it must be consumed immediately. Now, it reminds us that not all skill is slow and methodical like a Parmigiano Reggiano. Some of it is quite fast and instinctive. There is a physical intuition here where the cheesemakers rely on feel, temperature, elasticity, things that are fairly hard to teach and a little harder to master. So getting the exact cheese-making method of mozzarella di bufala is going to take some time. And that can be difficult to dedicate years of your life to one cheese. But if you're going to make it excellent and perfect, sometimes that's what it takes. If we were to look at something like a Conte, we can add another layer of precision. Conte is produced in very large wheels. often in Alpine-style dairies where multiple farms contribute to the milk used. Now, why is that difficult? The milk quality must be consistent across multiple producers. Seasonal variations affect the flavor and the structure. Aging can last anywhere from 12 to 24 months or more. And this introduces a different kind of precision than the other ones. It is a collective effort. It's not just one cheesemaker getting everything right. It's an entire cheese ecosystem working in harmony. And when it works, the result is incredibly complex. It's a very layered cheese. And when it doesn't work, it is so dull and dead that most often they won't even attempt to sell it. They can't sell it. It has to be perfect before it goes to sale. Another Alpine-style cheese, Gruyere. This one highlights a little bit more of the subtlety of what it takes to be a difficult cheese. It requires the right control over moisture and curd size. The flavor development is gradual and nuanced, and the texture must remain smooth and consistent throughout aging. Now, why it matters, Gruyere isn't bold or extreme. It's aiming for balance is one of the hardest things to achieve in food. It's a lot easier to make something loud, very sharp flavors, funky aftertastes, aggressive aromas, than it is to make something that is perfectly composed, where precision is the point, and in every bite, it will taste balanced. It's very rare, and I love that about Gruyere. Now, at the top of the episode, I did say we aren't going to be talking about cheddar, but a traditional cloth-bound cheddar is anything but simple. It's a little difficult because the cheddaring process requires careful timing and stacking of curds, but the cloth binding allows for natural rind development, which introduces variability. And aging, again, can expose the flaws in the texture and the flavor. Now, this is a great example of how something familiar can still be incredibly technical. It also shows how modern shortcuts like block cheddar or vacuum sealing remove a lot of that difficulty. So when you taste a traditional version, you're tasting the result of much more demanding process. Now, precision cheeses remind us that cheesemaking isn't just about letting nature take its course. It's about knowing when to intervene, knowing when to wait, and understanding how small details can ripple out over time. Those cheeses don't rely on shock value or rarity necessarily. They primarily rely on execution. And in many ways, they are the hardest cheeses of all, because there's no hiding behind novelty. If it's good, it's because it was made well. If it's not, there's nothing to blame but the process or the makers. And again, these are just a handful of cheeses that I selected for this category. There are hundreds of cheeses that are just as technical. In the next section, we're going to talk about cheeses that introduce a little bit of chaos, a little bit of controlled chaos, if you will. And these are cheeses where the work doesn't stop after the cheesemaker is done. In fact, you could argue that the real work begins during the aging process. This category is all about the ongoing intervention, the small repeated actions that shape the final product over time. Now, here's a washed rind cheese known for its strong aroma. Vieux Boulogneau requires constant monitoring. Its bacterial growth must be managed, and the environment must stay very consistent. And this shows that cheesemaking doesn't end after production. It continues through aging. We've talked about this with the aging of the cheddar and the Parmesan and the Gruyere and the Comté, but with this one, you are very much affected by how the aging changes the end result of the cheese. Some of the earlier cheeses, you can have a perfect cheese, but then something happens to it a year down the road. This one, you can make an average cheese, but then in aging is where you really get it to reach its peak. Another cheese would be Mimolette. It is, again, aged with mites that influence the rind. And a side note, cheese mites are basically little spiders. Mites just sounds a whole lot nicer. Now, why is this one difficult? It is balancing the beneficial versus the excessive mite activity, and has regulatory challenges. It demonstrates how tradition and modern regulation can sometimes clash. It also shows that even controlled chaos has boundaries, and those boundaries aren't always agreed upon. Next up is a classic washed rind cheese that is repeatedly bathed in brine or alcohol during aging, and it is Epoisse. It requires frequent washing to encourage the right bacteria. The moisture levels must be carefully controlled, and it can easily become overpowering or even break down too far. Now, this is a perfect example of how active care creates identity. Without the washing, this cheese wouldn't be what it is. But with too much intervention, it can lose its balance. And again, balance is key in some cheeses. And so the cheesemaker and the affineur, are constantly adjusting to find the right balance of this cheese's aging process. If you looked at a cheese like Taleggio, which is a softer washed rind cheese, it may look simple, but it's surprisingly sensitive. It requires humid aging environments. It requires surface bacteria, which must be encouraged without overwhelming the paste. And its texture can shift quite quickly if conditions aren't correct. Now, why this matters is Taleggio highlights how subtle changes in environment can dramatically affect the final product. This is controlled chaos at a little quieter level, but it's just as demanding. Now, one of the most famous cheeses for its intense aroma is Limburger, which is another wash rind cheese that depends heavily on surface bacteria. It requires strong bacterial development, which must be carefully managed. The flavor and aroma can become unbalanced very quickly, and it requires confidence in its process despite its intensity. Limburger shows that intensity is cultivated, and the cultivation requires skill, restraint, and a willingness to embrace something that many people initially reject. Now, why that category mattered at all? Controlled chaos cheeses sit right in the middle between precision and unpredictability. They require more consistency or care, their flexibility in response to any changes in the cheese as it ages, and a deep understanding of how environments can shape the outcomes. Day after day, you are trying to get the best cheese possible, and that involves staying involved. And in many ways, this is where cheese making becomes the most human, because it's not about perfection from the start. It's about paying attention, making adjustments, and guiding something towards its best possible version at the end. And after all of this, one truth starts to stand out, and it might be the most important takeaway of this episode. Some cheeses are difficult because of how they're made, but others are difficult because of how we feel about them. Because when you sit back and look at everything we've talked about, between mites, larvae, some rare milk, long aging, precision techniques, you kind of realize that the word difficult isn't just a technical category, it's kind of a cultural one. I mean, think about blue cheese again. If you've never seen it before and someone described it to you as, this is actually a really good thought process. If someone described cheese or even blue cheese to you for the first time, you would sound insane. Take milk that has been intentionally inoculated with mold, allow this milk to thicken and harden and allow it to grow veins throughout its interior, and then age it until it develops a sharp, pungent aroma. Some people might hesitate to think that that sounds delicious, but if you look at most societies in the world, it is familiar because it has been normalized, because you've seen it on a cheese board or a salad dressing label. It has become part of the norm, and so it feels safe. Now compare that to something like the Kazu Marzu. Scientifically, both involve biological transformation. Both cheeses involve organisms breaking down the cheese and contributing to flavor, but one is widely accepted and the other feels extreme. So what's the difference? Most of it, what I found, is visibility and familiarity. Mold is invisible in process and abstract in concept. The larvae are visible, active, and pretty hard to ignore. And I think the visibility changes everything. We all carry around an internal line of what feels edible and what doesn't. And that line is ultimately shaped by your culture, your exposure, your experience, and sometimes just pure habit going on. I'm not talking about the cheesemaker's challenges, as there are plenty, but I'm mostly talking about the world's challenge to get people to eat it, or in my case, to be able to pronounce it. A lot of cheeses are difficult for me to say. I've butchered many of them. I probably won't stop. I'm going to try to do my best. For a lot of people, the hardest part of trying a new cheese isn't the flavor, it's the moment right before you taste it. It's a little bit of hesitation. It's a question of, do I trust this? And that's why I wanted to bring this conversation up, and I think why it matters. Becoming more knowledgeable about cheese isn't just expanding your palate, it's about expanding your perspective on food as a whole, in general. It's learning to separate what is actually unsafe for what is simply familiar. And those are not the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean you have to try everything. I would encourage you to try more things than you have tried, but you don't have to eat mite-aged cheese if you don't want to. You don't have to go anywhere near live larvae if that weirds you out. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. But understanding why those cheeses exist, understanding their tradition, the process, and the intention behind them, I think that makes you more of an informed eater. And if you work in cheese or talk about cheese or build a platform around it, it makes you a better communicator because you're not just saying this is weird, you're saying this is different, and I have some ideas as to why. And that shift from judgment to understanding is where real expertise starts to show up. A big chunk of my cheese and wine education that I've had has been a lot of mentors and teachers trying to get me to be able to describe things better as you eat them or drink them or taste them in general. And that has been one of the hardest challenges as a cheesemonger when someone says, "Hey, what does that taste like?" Finding new and interesting ways to describe a flavor or a taste profile has been a little challenging, but also very rewarding because once you figure out a flow, you can really paint a verbal picture to someone who's never tried a cheese before so that when they go into it, they have a little bit of confidence based on your recommendation. And it's better than just saying, well, it tastes like milk. And some cheeses do taste like milk. So that's completely a fair thing to say if true. But if you're going after a Pleasant Ridge Reserve and you say it tastes like milk, that's not super fair to the product that that person is about to try. So in this conversation of what makes a cheese difficult, sometimes the difficulty can come from describing it. I think there is a lot of growth to be had in our country and in the world for how to describe food, not just, ooh, yum, yum, I want more, but how to make it more of a conversation. Now, today, we explored cheeses that challenge expectations in every direction. We looked at cheeses shaped by biology, where insects and mites become part of the process. We talked about cheeses defined by scarcity, where just getting enough milk is just the hardest part. We broke down cheeses that demand precision, where time, technique, and consistency have to align perfectly. And we explored cheeses that require constant care, where the work doesn't stop after the make, but continues every single day of aging. And through all of that, one idea keeps coming back. Difficulty in cheese isn't just one thing. It can be everything we've stated already, from a scientific reasoning, a cultural reasoning, a psychological barrier, the practicality of even making it, or the philosophical reason of what is safe to eat or what is socially acceptable to eat. And that question doesn't just apply to extreme cases we talked about. It kind of applies to everything in a cheese case, because every cheese, no matter how approachable, comes from a process that at some point required a lot of trust. Trust in bacteria, trust in time, trust in the transformation of a product that spoils very quickly. And how did some wizard find a way to turn it into a hard loaf of shelf-stable product? That takes a lot of trust from early humans to be able to turn that into one of the largest food staples in the world. And the more you understand that process, the more appreciation I hope you gain for all cheese, not just the wild ones. And here's my interesting take. You don't need to go out and try the most extreme cheese you can find after you listen to this episode. That's not really my goal. And I think I've touched on it, but the goal is mostly to shift your perspective just enough that the next time you're standing in front of a cheese case, you might look at something unfamiliar and think, okay, can I try this? I think I will try this. What's going on here? Let me look into this a little bit more. What's the story? What's the background? Instead of just a very quick and easy, nope, not for me, and then keep strolling. I think that moment, that slight pause of curiosity, is where a lot of stuff can change for you. And that's how people go from playing it safe to discovering something they genuinely love. The leap to trying something new doesn't usually come from the safest option. It comes from something outside of the comfort zone. Not necessarily extreme or intimidating, just different enough. Just a little different is all it takes. It doesn't have to be, I like cheddar, let me try larva. It could be, I like cheddar from Wisconsin. I've never had a cheddar from Nebraska. That scares me. But at the end of the day, it's worth a try. So maybe that's the big takeaway, is don't chase the most difficult cheeses in the world just to try them, but maybe try to understand more cheeses and the backgrounds of why they exist and how it may feel weird to you, but is actually completely appropriate and relatable to some of the other things you've already eaten. Thank you for listening. My name is Alex, and this has been The Modern Monger.